I can make it down that ramp. I said, there's no way I can make it down that ramp without falling on my ass. There's no way. General, somebody grab you so fast. I don't want that. And this was a steel ramp. Really, really steep. No hand, girl. It was like an ice skating rink. I said, there's no way. I can make it down that ramp without falling on my ass. Inch by inch, I took these little steps. When I was 10 feet short, I ran down the left. I ran down the ramp. I looked very handsome. I ran down the ramp. Trending number 1. And the ramp was probably 10 yards long.
This question is on COVID.
I think you're going to have a big surprise, a beautiful surprise, sooner than anybody would think. But the answer is...
I ran down the ramp. Trending number 1. And I don't want to get water on the tie, because I've done it. It spills down. It doesn't look good for a long time. And I don't want to test more people now. So I said to my people, slow the testing down. The ramp and the water and the test. How good was this speech? This speech has been the best. It's true. I ran down the ramp.
All right. So with that said, Linda. Hi, Linda.
I have a question for you. What do you think is your greatest accomplishment in your eyes?
I ran.
Hello all, welcome to Chicago Justice Show. I'm your host, Tracy Siska. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. You can find out more about the rest of our work, I guess I should say, at chicagojustice.org. There you will find a piece we just published this week. How common is violence against women in Chicago? The answer depends on the data. We will have Ellie, the author of that piece, on our show Wednesday at noon Central. And we'll be talking to her and going in depth about that piece. So yes, there was no show Wednesday, but I basically recorded it and dumped the whole show on the podcast. So follow the Chicago Justice podcast, which you're going to want to do, because as we start putting interviews, including more interviews in the show, which we're going to do today, of Rachel Levinson-Waldman from the Brennan Center, which I'll tell you a little bit more in a minute. We're only going to be playing pieces of those interviews on the show, and then the extended versions will be on the podcast only. The Chicago Justice Podcast. Get it wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so what's coming up today? As I said, I just teased Rachel. We have an interview with Rachel Levinson-Waldman, who is the Deputy Director of the National Security and Liberty Program at the Brennan Center for Justice in New York. Basically, we talk about this part of the interview that's on the show today is strictly about police surveillance of social media in general. And then when on the podcast extended version, we talk about specifically more in depth about the technologies and the LAPD specifically, and what the technologies they use, what they can piece together about you, where you live, where you work, where you frequent socially. All of that is available to the LAPD now, including all of your social media posts. It's really pretty frightening. Then if we, depending on time, we're going to talk about the DHS pushing false narratives about Antifa in Oregon and all the unrest there, and what the White House and other politicians were trying to push the Department of Homeland Security to say was going on in Oregon, and blame it all on that mysterious Antifa. And then if we have time, we're going to talk about the NYPD Sergeant Union, or the Sergeants Benevolent Association. Their offices were raided this week. If we don't have time to cover it on this show, it will definitely be on the podcast. So check it out, please. Okay, so Rachel Levinson-Waldman is a great researcher at the Brennan Center for Justice. It is really, their work is fascinating on trying to dig into the technologies and guidelines that kind of either restrain or don't restrain police use of social media. Or not use of it, but like surveillance of social media, use of false accounts, all of that stuff. It's really fascinating. It's a really interesting interview, and we dive deep, especially on the extended version, into the software that and the companies that make the software, what they're capable of doing, and how they're able to piece together DMV data and license plate reader data at any stop and frisk cars that they file on you. And they're able to do, and that license plate reader data can tell, to some extent, it can tell the police department who lives in the general area and who frequents there for social or work, depending on the hours you're there. It's really fascinating and really, really scary. The interview, this clip we're going to play for the show, runs just under 10 minutes. The clip for the extended version, for the podcast, runs 37 minutes. I really suggest you subscribe for the podcast and check out the extended version. There are going to be more. We have other interviews coming up over the next few weeks, and all of the extended version of those interviews will be on the podcast. This interview is really fascinating. I found it from a Guardian. I think it's either Guardian story. I'm sorry. I definitely found this out on the Guardian website, Guardian US. They ran a story in September about some new documents that the Brennan Center uncovered. It's part of their work. So I'm going to go and let Rachel Levinson talk for herself. I'll be back in 10 minutes, and we'll discuss the clip and then move on to other segments. Welcome, everyone, to the Chicago Justice Show. I am so happy today to welcome Rachel Levinson-Waldman, who is the Deputy Director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. And I'm going to give you a little spiel about the Brennan Center for Justice. It's an independent, nonpartisan law and policy organization that works to reform, revitalize, and when necessary, defend our country's systems of democracy and justice. God, that place must be busy. I live a mile from the insurrection. I can't imagine how busy they've got to be. Rachel, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So what is your work involved when you're, besides just liberty and national security? Can you give us a little more detail?
Sure. So I've been at the Brennan Center for almost 10 years now. And when the Liberty and National Security Program was originally started up, the Brennan Center overall is about 25 years old. We were originally focusing on basically post 9/11 civil liberties issues. So privacy, secrecy, surveillance, domestic intelligence gathering, Islamophobia, kind of the range of civil liberties and civil rights issues that arose post 9/11. So for instance, when I first came to the Brennan Center, I offered a report on basically what happens with all of the data. So after 9/11, the federal government especially was given a lot of new authorities to collect information about Americans that wasn't necessarily related to criminal activity. What happens with that, right? Where is it kept? For how long? Whom is it shared with? For what purposes? Things like that. So we're looking at that. I have colleagues who focus a lot on overclassification and the consequences for government transparency. A lot of work around countering violent extremism. These programs run by DHS and Department of Justice, and kind of what they have meant, the very shaky foundation that they're built on. I would say in the last probably 6 or 7 years, we've kind of expanded our purview to include not just narrowly national security per se, but also issues around policing and technology and civil liberties and civil rights. And that was coming out of a few things, partly seeing that a lot of the technologies that we were seeing in the hands of law enforcement, some of those come out of the national security sphere, things like stingrays, these devices that can locate a cell phone, right? These are sort of coming from our kind of war footing abroad and coming domestically. Often the funding for these technologies is justified kind of through a national security lens, right? So, either on the federal level or the local level, okay, law enforcement needs these technologies for counterterrorism purposes. They are mostly then used in the war on drugs, but that helps provide the funding for them. And the issues, the privacy issues, the constitutional issues, the Fourth and First Amendment issues that we were seeing in the national security sphere, all of those are playing out in very similar ways, kind of when these technologies and these enhanced powers are in the hands of police. So, we look at use of cell phone trackers, license plate readers, surveillance cameras, drones, social media, predictive policing programs, kind of a wide range of topics also in the policing and tech sphere.
Yeah, it's really scary. And I've tried to, when I taught at a couple of universities, I've tried to tell my students and try to ingrain in them, like, everything that you think should be authorized for the military or intelligence, and it's only going to get used overseas. America's history is replete with function creep problems, which means it never stays there. I know when the CPD got, when they were considering assault rifles, to give the police officers assault rifles, I started looking into it. Well, the makers of the M4, well, they were losing their government contracts because it was an unreliable weapon and the government wanted other rifles made. So they were dumping it to police departments. And they opened up a, hey, we can sell the local police departments. And that's how they got Chicago in it. And then, the superintendent said would only be under certain circumstances. We're like, okay, then pile up all the M4s for each, to each sergeant, give him an SUV, have his truck have the M4s in it. And when we need them, he can take them out and he can be responsible for their use. So when they're misused, he's fired, or give it to a lieutenant. Why does it have to be on the street with every officer? And they had no real good answer. And then, of course, they're used all the time for crowd control. I mean, there's massive issues. They're used all the time, right? And this is how bad Chicago is about things. In the general order to authorize the use of the M4, near the page 4 or 5 at the end was a line that said supervisors could not regulate who carried the gun as long as the officer did the qualification. So the bosses had no role. And it's, wow, there's function creep right there all by itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the Brennan Center / you submitted open records requests, or what we call in Chicago FOIA requests, to a variety of cities early in 2020 around their social media monitoring. What was going on with that? What was the motivation to do that?
Yeah, so exactly. So as you say, we submitted in early 2020, in January of 2020, we submitted these public records requests to 4 police departments. We have since submitted a 5th. So we have 5 that are outstanding in some way. One of them has kind of been closed. The rest are basically still in process and in various levels. So originally we submitted requests to the Baltimore Police Department, the Boston Police Department, the NYPD, New York Police Department, and the LAPD, the LA Police Department. And then more recently, we submitted a request to the DC Police Department, the Metropolitan Police, together with Data for Black Lives. So that was sort of a co-request. And the reason that we submitted these was that we had increasingly been seeing a lot of, kind of narrative accounts, a lot of media coverage of use of social media by law enforcement. We were doing a lot of writing on it and a lot of research on it. And although, it's always hard to get sort of a real concrete picture of how widespread the use of social media is, it basically seemed to be sort of, based on these anecdotal accounts, and also based on things like about 5 years ago, we did research on expenditures by police departments on social media monitoring tools, like third-party tools. For a variety of reasons, those were then kind of less in use for a while, though it appears that their use is picking back up. But at that point, we found over 150 departments that had spent at least $10,000 a year on these tools. The International Association of Chiefs of Police and the Urban Institute used to do a survey every year. They haven't published one since 2017. But they did a survey going out to police departments around the country, asking them about their use of social media. So the most recent survey, over 500 police departments responded, and the vast majority of those were using social media in some way, and especially probably 2/3 to 3/4 were using social media not just to do outward-facing communication. So not just, hey, we're looking for this person, or hey, we're hosting a block party or something like that, but using it for investigations, for intelligence, for situational awareness. So even though we couldn't always get an exact picture, and even though very few departments had publicly available policies that really spelled out their use of social media, it seemed that it was pretty widespread. So we had taken a look at the news to see where was it being reported that kind of major police departments seemed to be using social media, where at the same time, there wasn't a lot known about really like the contours and scope of that use. And so that was how we picked the police departments that we focused on. So for Baltimore, there had been coverage, especially around, Freddie Gray, his death and the protests around their use of a tool called Geophedia. In Boston, there had been coverage about their use of social media, including a very powerful report that the ACLU of Massachusetts put out coming out of a public records request they had done, showing that the Boston Police Department, together with the BRIC, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, which is their local fusion center, had used social media to track Black Lives Matter protesters, Muslim Lives Matter protesters. And then for NYPD, there had been coverage about their use of social media, and the same in LA. So we felt like there were sort of these seeds of information out there about this use, but not actually a lot of granular detail about what it looked like, and especially what it looked like now. And so thinking not just about their use of third-party social media monitoring tools, but just what policies do they have in place? Do they have any policies in place? Kind of how are officers being guided in their use of social media? What are rules around use of undercover accounts? Can social media be used for sort of broad-based situational awareness or just for criminal investigations? Kind of all of these issues where we felt like there was a lot more to know. And then similarly with our request to DC, there had been some coverage about their use several years ago of social media monitoring software. And we wanted to know more about what that looked like.
Okay, we're back. So let me give you a stat about something Rachel talked about. When the Illinois the International Association of Chiefs of Police did that survey, right? They did that survey about how many of them use social media for surveillance or investigations. The actual stat that they published, and this is from the Brennan Center's website, is 70%. 70%. And most of them, if not all of them, don't really have guidelines restricting it. That should scare the crap out of us. And you also have to think about, I think some people hear that and they're like, well, they got a suspect for murder. They go look on their Facebook page or Twitter page or Instagram page, see if they posted anything that connects them to it. Oh, I don't see anything wrong with that. Why do you see something wrong with that? Not saying I necessarily do. The problem is, and we've talked about this, I think, later in the interview again, it's function creep. Whenever you're talking about government surveillance, police surveillance, they can always come up with that rare time that they need it that justifies the use of it millions of times. Like, we need it for this one occasion or just for murders or whatever it is. So that's why we're going to get that software. That's why we're going to do that surveillance. Now, please don't regulate how we use this. You should just trust us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what is the police departments in Chicago, New York, Boston, LA, Philly? I mean, you can name any of them. What have they done that they should be trusted so much with what's going on? Just trust us. There's always going to be something, this concept. It's always about function creep. It's not about, you shouldn't be worried about why they're really asking and whether or not they should be allowed to do it for the legitimate reasons. Because those aren't really the reasons they want to use it. You have to worry about the illegitimate use, because there almost always is, if not always is, illegitimate use of any increase in technology, gear, like whether it's pepper spray or mace or tasers or and early on in the Chicago police department in the early 90s, 1900s, right? And in the 40s, 50s, whatever, they had shotguns in the car. Why'd they take them out? Well, because they couldn't be trusted because they were using them to shoot people through the door. They'd knock on the door, say it's police, come to the door, we need to talk to you. As they walk to the door, they'd shoot them through the door. So they took shotguns away. You can't trust them. They must be restricted. And pro-police force like, oh no, you got to trust them. No, I don't trust them. There is not a single example, I don't think, of you can use a technology or an increase in weaponry or anything that hasn't been massively misused by one department or another or by all of them. It's just the way it goes. They will always do it. So in the extended version, as I've said, on the podcast, please go subscribe. On the Chicago Justice Podcast, you can get the entire 37-minute extended interview version, and there we dive deep into LA and the software and what those specific softwares like Plantair and Geophidia, what they can actually do. And it should scare the hell out of you. It scares the hell out of me. Okay, so please go like and subscribe. We're going to move on to our next segment. Segment number 2. This is a piece done by the Oregon Public Broadcasting. Yep. Have not used them before on the show. The title of this is Senior Homeland Security Leaders Pushed Unfounded Antifa Conspiracies at 2020 Portland Protests, report states. Oopsies. Once again, it's the mysterious, incredibly large, incredibly organized, incredibly well-funded, incredibly, unbelievably big and nefarious Antifa. With all the money spent by the right to prove there's an Antifa, you think they'd have found more things. Okay. This is a report by a Trump-era Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security. It was just released by a congressperson in Oregon. It's heavily redacted, but there are some things. Let's get to the coverage. And this will also, if the police social media surveillance hasn't scared the crap out of you, wait till you hear this. It's a little long. On the same day, a violent mob of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol. The Department of Homeland Security received a damning internal report during the Trump era about its intelligence operations targeting racial justice protesters in Portland last summer. It outlines how senior leadership pushed unfounded conspiracies about anti-fascists, encouraged staff to violate constitutional rights, and made spurious connections between protesters who engaged in criminal activity. The report, made available Friday, found that in addition to attempting to politicize intelligence, senior DHS leaders pressured subordinates to illegally search phones. Open source intelligence collectors who analyzed intelligence pulled from publicly available sources. This is Plantair, Geophidia, and others. Those things also created dossiers on protesters and journalists, despite those people having no clear connections to domestic terrorism or homeland security concerns. Of course, it's the massive right-wing conspiracy to connect any protest to Antifa, massive conspiracy to delegitimize them and to take them down and to use government force to repress them. The article continues. While the report says there's no direct pressure to change intelligence, at least one analyst paints a much starker picture. Quote, you could see where the VAA, which was the Department of Homeland Security people, definition was coming from a mile away. Violent Antifa, I forget what the other AA stands for, but it's basically Antifa. So you can see where the violent Antifa definition was coming from a mile away. This analyst is quoted in the report. He got tired of, redacted, but I'm sure it's Trump, telling him they didn't have the reporting, and he was convinced it was Antifa, so he was going to fix the problem by changing what the collectors were reporting. That's right, they were changing the intelligence. Breaking all the laws. They don't care. We're white-wingers. We know everything. We know it-allism. We suffer from know-it-allism. So even when the research and the data doesn't prove it, we're going to make sure it proves it. Throughout the federal deployment to Portland, officers from the Federal Protective Services requested assistance from the Department of Homeland Security's Homeland Identities Targeting and Exploitation Center to search protesters' cell phones. The team found that searches were illegal and resisted pressure from senior Homeland Securities to assist FPS. These requirements generally translate into the necessity for having a warrant and sending a written request to the Office of Intelligence and Analysis for assistance. FPS provided neither, the report found, adding that senior leaders continued to pressure the exploitation center to ignore legal barriers. Of course. So the major rights violations, the major law breaking that was going on in Portland was actually the response from the feds. The article continues, and this is the last piece I'll read from it. Some Homeland Security staff spoke up over concerns that it was likely illegal to collect massive amounts of information on U.S. citizens with no connection to domestic terrorism. Those concerns were dismissed. Some staff refused to work on the reports because they were basically creating these dossiers they called baseball cards internally on every protester that was arrested or stopped. Everyone that they identified. DHS offered to help the Portland Police Department to search phones. Now, did that make a difference? It didn't. Why? Legislators in action. The city council passed an ordinance, a law, however you want to phrase it there, that barred the Portland Police Department from working with the Department of Homeland Security. Did you hear that? The Portland City Council passed a law that barred the Portland Police Department from working with the Department of Homeland Security. One would think, if America was what it used to be, that the department, that a city council having to bar the police department from working with the feds because of massive law breaking, massive unwarranted surveillance, that would be huge news. Not only would it be huge news, that would be enough for people to start calling for the recall of the president that's authorizing it, the attorney general, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, all the officials involved in this. Why weren't they? Why didn't something happen? This is massive, maybe unprecedented, we don't really know, but it seems unprecedented. Surveillance of protesters by the Department of Homeland Security that should have never been created and should be abolished. It's unbelievable that this was allowed to happen in America, and there basically seems no repercussions. The report released by the congressman was heavily redacted, but still in all of it, you're getting plenty of information to show you just how screwed up this was. It's unbelievable. And it's very, very scary. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Two depressing pieces back to back there. Once again, the extended interview with Rachel will be on the podcast, Chicago Justice Podcast. Please subscribe. Also, we're going to try to include a segment on the raid of the Sergeants Benevolent Association, the Sergeants Union in New York. There have been some developments since it first broke earlier this week, and it is a beautiful story. And you're going to see the connections between the head of that union and the head of the Chicago Fraternal Order of Police and how similar they are. The rhetoric and hate-filled tweets are so similar. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We will see you Monday morning, 9 a.m. Chicago time. Please subscribe to the podcast. Later today, early tomorrow, the latest version will be posted with the extended interview of Rachel and the FBI raiding the Sergeants Union. Thank you so much. Have a great day.